For 200 years, a single family dominated India and astonished the world. A family known to history as the Great Mughals. The Khyber Pass, famous not only for its wild, romantic scenery, but also because this is the gateway from rugged Afghanistan to the riches of India. Through these mountains have come a succession of great conquerors, restless for new lands to plunder. Alexander the Great came by, so did Genghis Khan, and Tamburlaine. And if today the armed men are more local, in recent years most often the Mujahideen from Afghanistan, this remains a dangerous and exciting place, with the promise, once over the top, of India. The first large town through the pass is Peshawar, now in northwest Pakistan. This has always been a busy meeting place of merchants and adventurers, and no doubt the armies of those conquerors contributed their bit too to the racial mix, passing back through here with the spoils of India on their way home. But one conqueror who came through here in the 16th century intended to stay in India. He was a buccaneer with royal blood in his veins. His name was Barbur. Barbur had a direct link with those earlier conquerors, being descended on one side from the leader of the Mongols, Genghis Khan, and on the other from that equally ferocious predator, Tamburlaine. But his own descendants would rule with even greater splendor. Their court in India became famous throughout the world for its lavish display, astounding the European visitors who witnessed this scene, and who would call these emperors the Great Mughals, meaning the Great Mongols. Their exquisite paintings and buildings, together with often grisly deeds of treachery, would add up to an irresistibly exotic oriental melodrama. The family liked to imply that they ruled almost the whole world, enabling the lion to lie down with the lamb. But the early days of Barbur himself had been very much humbler. His father had ruled a small kingdom to the north of Afghanistan, but he died when Barbur was only 11, and his inheritance was grabbed by a stronger neighbor. By his late teens, Barbur was living more like a bandit than a prince. He and a few followers would roam around, seizing cattle, territory, wealth of any kind. In such a violent world, the villages and towns were all fortified, as indeed most of them still are today. And Barbur describes vividly in his diary how he and his men would ride out at night to attack just such a place as this. Under cover of darkness, they would place their ladders against the wall. Often they were seen and had to ride away disappointed. But sometimes they got in, and then, after an exhilarating hand-to-hand fight in narrow lanes, they would take what they fancied, or perhaps persuade this particular village to join their league. Barbur's following steadily increased. He was a leader who inspired great loyalty. And then there came a great breakthrough. In 1504, when he was 21, he captured a rich, sophisticated city, one which he would hold for the rest of his life, and which he came to think of as his real home. It was Kabul, now the capital of Afghanistan. Set among mountains to the west of the Khyber Pass, here was an ancient city in which Barbur and his followers could settle down to a more civilized existence. The main cultural influence on this part of the world came from Persia. Barbur, himself a keen poet and gardener, was able now to indulge in traditional Persian pleasures, of a kind which he and his family would later introduce to India. But a ruler in those days could never relax for long. A regime based only on military power needed constant new conquests to bring in more territory, more wealth. In three directions, Babur's kingdom at Kabul was unable to expand. To the north was a powerful new ruler who had been grabbing vast territories, including Babur's ancestral kingdom. To the west was the even more powerful empire of Persia. To the south, desert. That left only the east through the Khyber Pass. Northern India was ruled by many rival princes, too busy fighting each other to be likely to combine against an invader, and the prize was a rich one. India was fertile, and an army could advance unopposed in these vast plains after victory in a single pitched battle. When the time for that battle came, Barbur would have one great advantage, a magic new weapon. In Dara, just through the Khyber Pass, firearms are the stock in trade. Everyone here is busy making them. But when Barbur came this way with his new muskets, which had reached him from Persia, no one knew what these strange objects were. He describes tribesmen making obscene gestures at this weapon that fired no arrow, until it went off in their direction. Nearly 500 years later, the magic of the musket may have been explained away, but it remains as important as ever to get hold of a good weapon, and people here will drill whatever barrel you require. Every day, as the customers try out the wares, the valley resounds with gunfire. In addition to his muskets, Barbur had some very elementary artillery. He had a Turkish gunner by the name of Ustad, meaning master, who'd been able to cast a mortar for him. A tubby vessel, something the shape of a deep vase, which when tilted upwards could fire a large stone for almost a mile. Barbur had vastly enjoyed watching the hot metal being poured to cast this ultimate deterrent, and he loved the excitement when it was fired. The mortar could only manage 12 shots a day, so each one was something of an event, of which Barbur kept himself well informed. A typical entry in his diary reads, "At the midday prayer, a person came from Ustad saying, 'The stone is ready. What is the order?' The order was, 'Fire this stone off, but keep the next till I come.'" But if the big mortar was just a wonderful toy, it was the muskets which would make the real difference. When Barbur advanced into India, he would face a vast array of elephants and cavalry, a living force far greater than anything that he could match. But with his muskets, he was able to rely on a tactic which is now familiar to all of us from countless westerns. He lashed together 800 wagons with rawhide ropes, and behind this barricade, his musketeers only had to wait till the vast, glittering ranks of Indian elephants and cavalry came within range. his victory, Barbur moved unopposed to the heart of northern India, through Delhi and onto the city which more than any other is now associated with the great Mughals. All the famous buildings here in Agra were created for Barbur's descendants and their families. The Taj Mahal is but one of many. In this city, which would later display to the world his family's magnificence, Barbur had a foretaste of the wealth of India. Among the booty captured here was a rather large diamond, the Koh-i-Noor, which is now the jewel in the crown of the British crown jewels. Barbur was a keen observer of the world about him, and soon he was finding much to marvel at in this land which he had so rapidly conquered. Here was a culture entirely different from the Muslim world, which had so far been the limit of his own experience. A scene of colourful and noisy ritual, and one in which women, whether in stone or in flesh, played a far more visible role, as here in a temple in Udaipur. The Hindu religion developed much earlier than Islam, and this sort of thing was exactly what the Quran, like the Old Testament, most strongly disapproved of: idols. But Barbur was too fascinated by life to waste much time on indignation. Instead, he was soon writing a section in his diary entitled Description of India. It begins boldly. India, he notes, is extensive, full of people, and full of produce. It was the profusion and colour of life in India that most amazed Barbur, as indeed it does any visitor today. And he was astonished by the number of craftsmen, though he does complain that it was impossible to get a decent pair of trousers made. With all wealth depending in the end on what the land and human skill can produce, it was perfectly evident that there were better pickings to be had here than in Afghanistan. Though in India's summer heat, Barbur did always feel dreadfully homesick for the mountains of his youth. The Hindu city of Gwalior, 80 miles south of Agra, was a place where Barbur noted down his impressions in great detail. He first came here on September the 27th, 1528. That day he had earache, and so had taken opium, which was causing him to vomit when he visited this great fort. But, like any good tourist, he put up with that. The palace had been completed only 20 years earlier, and it greatly impressed Barbur. He noted the tiles, which included, he said, the semblance of banana trees. What struck him most was the work of the masons. These were, he wrote, wonderful buildings, entirely of hewn stone. Indian masons have always treated blocks of sandstone as freely as carpenters in other countries shape and carve planks of oak. Here in these courtyards was a Hindu architectural tradition, which Barbur's grandson, the Emperor Akbar, would later put to excellent effect. There was one aspect of Gwalior which deeply displeased Barbur, the famous Jain carvings in the rock face. These idols, confided the emperor to his diary, are shown quite naked, without covering for the privities. I, for my part, ordered them to be destroyed. Upon his orders, the faces and the offending privities were smashed. Modern restorers seem to have partly agreed with him. Only the faces have been replaced. The illustrations, done later for his diary, reflect Barbur's fascination with the wildlife of India, though the artists don't always seem to have studied nature as closely as he might have wished. One frequent complaint in his text is the lack in India of good, cool streams. All the Mughal emperors loved water, and where they didn't find it in nature, they set about providing it in gardens. This garden in Agra, the Rambagh, is believed to have been laid out by Barbur himself. It follows the rectangular system of the water gardens of Persia, just as in the paintings. Water flows through the channels laid for it and tumbles and trickles into pools, as the engineer carries out the plans approved by Barbur himself. He had made several such gardens in Kabul, and the ones he created here in India no doubt helped to remind him of home.
Barbur would come to his gardens for a task which he very much enjoyed, that of writing up his diary from the notes he had taken all his life. And the tale he had to tell was among the most romantic of life's basic plots, the rags to riches story, from the early days, with sometimes just a couple of hundred followers, to all the wealth of India. And it was here in Agra that he decided to celebrate his success. He would give a sort of empire warming party. Word was sent out that all who had helped him on his way should come to receive fitting benefits. Even quite humble people were invited. A man who had once helped him across a river on a raft, some peasants who had sheltered him in Afghanistan. It took a couple of years for all the guests to arrive, and then there was a huge feast, with Barbur under a pavilion in the center, and the guests stretched out in a great semicircle of 100 yards or more. There was much present giving, and dancing, and acrobatics, and general self-satisfaction.
In India's climate, most celebrations still take place in the open air. From everyday picnics to more special occasions, a meal on the grass or on carpets remains a part of social life. It's nearly 500 years now since Barbur's great feast, but the music, the food and the clothes here today are still true to the past, though at Barbur's party the only women would have been the dancing girls. But his celebrations were premature. The as the new empire depended far too much on Barbur himself. 2 years after the feast, he died. His had been an action-packed life. He was still only 47. And though his dynasty would later prosper, as this painting reveals, it was to be a close-run thing. He was succeeded by his son Humayun, aged 22, who had fought beside his father in the capture of northern India, but was a very different character.
Humayun had nothing of his father's brisk energy. He was charming, sentimental, much given to scenes of tearful reconciliation with those who had conspired against him, and superstitious, exceedingly superstitious.
The superstition that dominated Humayun's life was one that is still an everyday feature of India. This marriage procession, a familiar sight in the streets here, couldn't possibly happen without the precise time being chosen in advance by an astrologer. The mysterious compulsion to have one's horoscope done is not confined to the East. But Humayun tried to organize his entire civil service by the signs of the zodiac, far more ambitious than the simple personal attention that most people want from the astrologer. In Humayun's astrological civil service, the officials responsible for the earth signs naturally took charge of agriculture. The water signs had the canals, while the fire people busied themselves with military matters. But astrology won few battles, and soon the Mughal armies were suffering some unpleasant shocks. Humayun himself had to make several humiliating departures from the battlefield, including one hurried escape across the Ganges, hanging on to an inflated goat skin. The empire, which he had inherited from his father in 1530, extended far across northern India. 10 years later, he had lost control of the whole of it, and was wandering as a refugee in the deserts of Rajasthan, with his family and a dwindling band of courtiers. Their circumstances were already bleak, but there was worse to come. In the heat of the desert, there is no greater relief than to come across a working well. But this was to be an increasingly rare sight that summer for Humayun and his family. They began to find that most of the wells they came across were dry. They had been filled with sand, the buckets were clogged and empty. The cause was a clash with Hindus. Members of Humayun's party had killed some cows, sacred animals to any Hindu. Rajasthan is a fiercely Hindu territory, and the people here had been deeply offended. It was because of this sacrilege that the wells were being filled by followers of the ruler of Jaisalmer, one of the great desert strongholds of Rajasthan. This kingdom was just the sort of place Humayun's descendants would have to come to terms with if they were to recover and hold India. But for the moment, mere survival had become the one priority for the evicted emperor and his family.
They plodded hopelessly on, though one small miracle, which was often later retold with delight in family history, did seem like a good omen. A young wife of Humayun's was just 15 years old, but was also 8 months pregnant. And she now felt that famous arbitrary longing of pregnancy for one particular kind of food. In her case, a pomegranate, something impossible to come by in the desert. But then, happily, their path crossed with that of a traveling merchant. And he was found to have, in his saddlebag, one large, juicy pomegranate. Then, a month later, at a small oasis, the real miracle. The birth of a son who would later radically transform the family's fortunes. They called him Akbar.
He would spend his childhood as a refugee because his father would soon be chased right out of India. But against all the odds, Humayun later fought his way back in to recover the empire. And Akbar, the child of the desert, would grow up to deserve, more than any other member of his family, that simple but resounding title, the Great Mughal. The powerful fort of Rohtas in Pakistan was built during the boyhood of Akbar, the greatest of the great Mughals. But it was built by a rival who had driven Akbar's father from India, a mere 15 years after the family had conquered the land. The Mughal Empire now seemed little more than a 9 days wonder. But then India fell once more into chaos, and Akbar's father managed to fight his way back past here to recover his kingdom. It was the plains of northern India which the Mughal family had conquered in 1526, and which Akbar's father, Humayun, now recovered, settling back into his capital city at Delhi. It was only just in time, for 6 months later he was dead, but at least that meant it was here in Delhi that his tomb would rise, as the first of the great Mughal monuments, giving a reassuring, if so far entirely false, sense of stability and power. Above the tomb, a dome, like a bud which would later flower in the dome of the Taj Mahal, reflecting the Persian traditions behind the Mughal family. Poetry played an important part in Persian court life, and with pleasures such as these, Humayun now relaxed once again in Delhi. As well as reading poems, a favourite game was to improvise them, and naturally his reconquest of India was the most popular subject of all. It was into this building that Humayun now moved his precious collection of family manuscripts. This was the scene of the poetry readings, but the scene also of a disastrous accident.
One day in 1556, Humayun was up here on the roof of his library. He'd been hearing the latest news from Mecca, from some pilgrims who had recently returned, and he was discussing with his astrologers the hour at which they expected Venus to rise, because he intended to hold an assembly at that propitious moment. And when that time had been agreed, he began to go down these steep stone steps. And then, something which the astrologers had evidently not foreseen. His foot was on the second step, when he heard a muezzin from the nearby mosque calling the faithful to prayer. And as Humayun turned to incline his knee in respect, he tripped in his robe and fell headlong down. He died 3 days later. And in such an unstable empire, the sudden death of the emperor automatically meant a political crisis. Humayun's son, Akbar, was already an experienced soldier, even though he was still only 13 years old. But he happened to be hundreds of miles away campaigning in the Punjab. If the news got out before Akbar was publicly enthroned, it was certain that others would attempt to seize power. As the first rumours spread, anxious crowds gathered below the fort. So Humayun's courtiers fell back on an ancient ruse. Someone who vaguely resembled the dead emperor was dressed up in his clothes and waved reassuringly at the crowd at a suitable distance. No doubt some of the people were fooled for some of the time, and meanwhile the action had moved elsewhere. When the news reached Akbar, he was miles from anywhere in this vast plain. He had with him an experienced general to keep an eye on the boy, and the general now organized a hurried but essential ceremony. There had to be a coronation. The king is dead, long live the king. It's quite a pilgrimage now to get to the platform which commemorates that event. Known as the Throne of Akbar, this surely has to be the least visited of all Mughal monuments. Well, here at last it is, with just some water buffaloes now standing where the courtiers did on that distant day, and a rather brutal Ministry of Works fence separating it from the surrounding countryside. It's in a very dilapidated state, but you can just see how it must have been as a Mughal monument. Here, for example, water would have come rippling down over a carved stone, a very Mughal detail. Dreary though this looks, it's a most evocative place, because that event, here in the middle of nowhere in 1556, was to be the turning point for Akbar's family, leading to more than 100 years of astonishing achievements. But on the face of it, as he sat here that day in a golden robe specially made for the occasion, the prospect was bleak. It was only to his own army grouped around him that he was emperor. Others would have different ideas. His claim to rule was not that strong. His father and his grandfather had between them notched up only 15 years ruling in India. And there were plenty of rival rulers who would now see a young boy on the throne as just the chance they'd been waiting for. As proof of that, it wasn't long after Humayun's death before a large Hindu army captured Delhi, and then moved in this direction to drive Akbar from India. In the resulting battle, the Mughals were heavily outnumbered, and if they'd lost that battle, there would have been no Mughal empire. In the event, they were saved by a stroke of luck. A chance arrow hit the Hindu general in the eye, and the sight of him, slumped so visibly on top of his elephant, caused his army to flee. On such small incidents, the tide of events can turn. By the end of the battle, the Mughals had captured nearly 1,500 elephants, and it was like that many tanks, in perfect condition and with plenty of fuel and ammunition, falling into the hands of a modern army. So Akbar and the elephants were able to march back together into Delhi, for the moment unopposed.
After the victory, a tower was built using the heads of the enemy, a custom whenever the defeated were non-Muslims. Rotting by the roadside, this was not a tradition well calculated to appease the local community. The young Akbar, on the face of it, seemed unlikely to appease anything. Physical danger was what he loved. Indeed, he'd been so much the athletic schoolboy that he never even learnt to read. Yet this was the emperor, Akbar, who had come to see the problems of India with its rival communities of Muslims and Hindus in a new and very unconventional light, shocking many of his own Muslim followers in the process. The great centre of Hindu power lay to the southwest of Delhi, in the area known as Rajasthan, the land of the Rajas. Their fortresses dotted this ancient and highly colourful territory, and two in particular would be of great importance to Akbar: Chittor and Amber, which is now known as Jaipur. At the top of this fort in Rajasthan, there is a most unusual feature: a seat. It's perfect now for enjoying a quite spectacular view, but that wasn't its purpose.
It seems that this was a throne for use in times of siege. Here the Maharaja would sit, exposed but visibly in command, conducting the campaign if there were enemies below to be driven back. From this perfect vantage point, he could see the build-up to an assault and choose where to fling his own men into the attack.
The ferocity of the fighting men of Rajasthan, the famous Rajputs, was legendary. They were known as the greatest warriors in all India, reckless in their courage, a reputation sustained by their habit of going into battle high on opium.
These were people that Akbar would either have to subdue or make friends with. The rulers of this particular fort later became known as the Maharajas of Jaipur. They came to terms with Akbar, and the beauty of their city, the largest in Rajasthan, suggests that there were advantages in doing so.
Jaipur was built as a completely new city after 2 centuries of alliance with the Mughals. It all began with a marriage. At an Indian wedding, even today, the bridegroom, with a small male relation mounted in front of him, goes on horseback to meet his bride. But when Akbar took a wife from the ruling family here in 1562, it was out of the question that he should ride to her. It was she who was sent to him. To present a bride to Akbar was a way of making an alliance, in effect like signing a treaty. And as he travelled round with his court, building up his fragile empire, he made many such arrangements. His harem contained some 5,000 women, mostly slave girls. Among his wives there were several Hindu princesses, each a token of friendship from her own family. But the first had been the bride from Jaipur. And beneath the fort there would soon appear the famous palace of Akbar, the first unmistakable sign of a new prosperity. It was built some 40 years after the wedding by a Maharaja who had become Akbar's leading general. His palace has become one of the great sights of India. For the tourists, an elephant ride up to Akbar is a compulsory item on everyone's schedule. The most impressive details were naturally in the Maharaja's own quarters, with patterns of inlaid stones and fragments of mirror. Here, in pavilions placed between the public part of the palace to one side and the harem to the other, the ruler could entertain either outside visitors or his own women, in surroundings that would delight them all. A few miles away, in their new city of Jaipur, the Maharajas of Akbar would build another palace. And it's here that their present-day descendant lives. I asked him what benefits he felt there had been for either side in the family's long relationship with the Mughal emperors.
The Mughals got governors and generalship from the House of Akbar, and the House of Akbar got the peace and tranquility to be able to pursue and build the city of Jaipur, and was again considered one of the main Hindu and Rajput states of that period.
And what about religion?
Well, again, it gave Raja Jai Singh great time to protect the Hindu religion during his reign.
Akbar spent much of his time moving round with a vast army, using the sport of hunting as his diplomatic cover. Any troublesome ruler might soon find the emperor killing deer on his own doorstep, with the infantry standing in as beaters. One of the ways of hunting that the emperor most enjoyed was with the cheetah, the Indian leopard, the fastest animal on earth. It can be unleashed for the kill like a hawk. This crowded scene, with a fence in the background, depicts another favorite way of hunting. Akbar's soldiers would drive the deer in from miles around in an ever-shrinking circle. Then, as soon as the terrified animals were contained in a small enough space, the portable fence would be put up around them, and riding in with sword or lance or gun, the emperor would indulge in an orgy of killing. On one occasion, on a vast plain such as this, 50,000 beaters drove in game from 60 miles around, a very large army in disguise. No wonder most rulers proved friendly when Akbar passed by. But there were exceptions, in particular the Rana of Mewa, who held the great fort of Chittor. As the senior prince of Rajasthan, he openly scorned the House of Amber for having given a daughter to the Mughal harem. Akbar determined that this proud knee must bend. In 1567 he arrived below the fort with his army, which included Hindu princes from Amber. Chittor itself is nearly 4 miles long, but Akbar's camp extended 10 miles. It was to be one of the most famous sieges in Indian history. Akbar used 2 methods of assault, both of which are shown in these views done by his painters. One was mining, burrowing under the walls with explosives. The idea was to blow up a section for the soldiers to enter the fort. But fuses were unreliable, and the Mughal army suffered a major disaster when a charge went off in 2 stages. The first blew the intended hole in the wall, but the second exploded as the Mughals stormed the breach, killing several of Akbar's favorite officers. The other method was a fortified corridor, which was gradually extended until it reached the walls. From its protection, snipers, often including Akbar himself, would get closer and closer shots at the defenders. For 4 months, this daily trial of strength dragged painfully on. The siege came to a sudden end because of a single bullet. There had appeared on the ramparts on that particular day a Hindu officer, and in the way of the times, the bullet that killed him was soon credited to the gun of the emperor himself. It's true that Akbar did take an active part in the daily business of sniping at the fort, and it may well be that he did fire the lucky shot. But the significance of what had happened was not immediately appreciated in the Mughal camp, until they observed that fires were breaking out all over the fort. Then the Hindu generals in Akbar's army were able to explain to him what was happening. The man who had died must have been the prince in command of the fort, and the fires were part of a grisly but hallowed Rajput ceremony which always took place whenever defeat seemed inevitable.
यानी कि हम जब राजपूत हार जाते हैं तो भी हमारी राजपूत परिवार की स्त्रियां जोहर में जलती हैं. जोहर शब्द का मतलब
The Johar, described to every visitor here, is the favorite incident in Chittor's history, a symbol of the unyielding pride of Rajasthan. For the wives of Rajput warriors, death rather than dishonor was the compulsory tradition in the face of defeat. They were all burnt before their husbands sallied forth to meet their own equally certain end in a final, hopeless battle. Inside the fort there were some 40,000 peasants living, and, unusually for him, Akbar now allowed them too to be massacred. Clearly this victory over the uncompromising Rana of Mewar was to be taken as an example. The city of Udaipur reveals that the Rana himself compromised in a rather different way. He had left his men to defend Chittor while he withdrew to start again here, further removed from the centres of Mughal power. An unglamorous decision, but it preserved the independence of his house, which never intermarried with the Mughals, and it gave us one of India's most beautiful cities. Today, the Rana of Mewar still feels it a matter of pride that the Mughals were kept at arm's length.
Now, we knew that if we were going to compromise with the Mughals, we would not be allowed to live with any self-respect in a Mughal court, and therefore we were very keen to protect our self-respect. The other reason is that our family is religious, deeply religious, and we believe in the values set out in Hinduism, and people look up to our family as the custodians of Hinduism, and whenever the Hindu faith and the Hindu religion was threatened, we were not prepared to compromise, and we fought for protecting the faith.
To celebrate his victory over the Hindus of Chittor, Akbar made a pilgrimage to a great Muslim shrine. It was to Ajmer that he went, to visit the tomb of a saint who had brought to India the more tolerant strain of Islam known as Sufism. His shrine remains a holy place today. The saint here had died 3 centuries before Akbar's visit, but it was to be a living saint who had now become of great importance to the emperor. Fatehpur Sikri is on the itinerary of most visitors to India today, but in the mid-16th century it was just a minor place of pilgrimage. There was a saint living here of the same tolerant sect as the saint at Ajmer, and like other holy men, he would receive visits from those seeking comfort or advice. In 1568, one of the pilgrims who came for advice was the young emperor, who would later build at the top of these steps the great Victory Gateway leading into the mosque.
When Akbar came to visit the saint who lived near here, he brought him a pressing problem. He was now 26, but in spite of his large number of wives, he still had no son. Well, the saint gave an uncompromising answer. Without hedging his bets, in the usual way of soothsayers, he declared categorically that the emperor would have not 1 son, but 3. Soon after these comforting words, news came that the Hindu princess from Amber was pregnant. For safety's sake, Akbar sent her to live near the saint, and here a boy was born. A year later, another princess was pregnant. She too was sent here, another son. And 2 years after that, a 3rd boy, exactly fulfilling the saint's prophecy. But with a track record like that, an emperor does not stand idle. And that was why, over the next few years, Fatehpur Sikri became increasingly important in Akbar's life.
The palace, which Akbar would now build beside this mosque, was a gesture of gratitude to the saint, of confidence in the future, and of exuberance. An exuberance reflected, it's pleasant to imagine, in an entertainment offered to the visitors here by one particular old man, several times a day. When Akbar began to build here at Fatehpur Sikri, he had been 17 years on the throne. Since that hurried coronation as a boy in the plains of the Punjab, he had turned his shaky inheritance into a stable empire. He was just 30, and there was still much to achieve. But now, with those 3 sons born here, there would be someone to pass it all on to. His family's future had never looked better.